All
Uh,
right.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's local government education webinar provided by University of Illinois Extension. My name is Lisa Merrifield, and I am currently an community and economic development specialist with Illinois Extension. For sound quality, we will mute microphones during the presentation. Use the chat space to send questions to the speakers. If you have any problems connecting, add those questions to the chat space. I will monitor the chat space and pose questions and comments to the speakers at the end of the presentations. Today's webinar is part of our Sustainable Communities series, and it is on public places for the 21st century, using green spaces to reach the triple bottom line. Today's recorded webinar will be made available on our local government education website and on our YouTube channel. Our presenters today are Kathy Krzyzewska, who is a designer in residence with the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Illinois, and Lane Kanoki, who is a landscape design contractor with Curry & Associates Engineering Incorporated. This time, I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lisa. As Lisa mentioned, I'm a designer in resident with the Department of Landscape Architecture. And my talk today is going to focus on aesthetics and design and the principles for eco-urban application, and kind of cover a couple of case studies that have implemented these and some of the concerns facing designers today. My research currently is focused on the agricultural environment and how to integrate some of the design practices that we use in the urban landscape and connect with the larger ecology and design concerns of the agricultural landscape. And I'm also teaching a design class on the natural precedent in planting, so ways in which we can use native plants more effectively and achieve some of our aesthetic goals in our design process. So today I'm going to cover two parts. First is to discuss the 8 basic design guidelines that many designers use when working with the landscape, and some of the applications for these design in ways in which we can achieve a more triple bottom line approach to landscape design, and what are the challenges that these designs face. So to begin with, the 8 basic theories or guidelines have been taken from how we read art and art history, how we translate landscape from our interaction with design. And these 8 basic theories include unity, simplicity, balance, color, natural transition, line, proportion, and repetition. So as I said, the 8 basic theories or guidelines for design within the landscape include these 8 basic principles, and these principles are ways in which we can describe aesthetics in the landscape. They aren't ways in which how we necessarily interpret beauty, or how we agree or disagree with whether beauty or aesthetics are present. These are simply tools in which designers and artists have used to achieve aesthetics in the landscape. Some of the sources that I'll be driving from in both parts of my talk have come from Piero Duff and his work on Planting a New Perspective. Also, the research done by Stuart Eccles and Eliza Pennypacker with Penn State and their artful rainwater design research. They've done a wonderful job in which they've looked at natural resources as a way to incorporate art into the landscape rather than hiding these natural resources. Also, the work Planting in a Post-Wild World has been formative, in which landscape architects use plants in the landscape. And the historically relevant work of ornamental grasses brought to us by Wolfgang Ome, and how he has taken this new texture that ornamental grasses and ornamental plants in the landscape and introduced a new aesthetic. So to begin with, the first principle, unity, it should be one of the main goals in any design landscape. And the reason that I'm introducing these 8 basic principles is more than anything to help you, the viewer and the user of landscape, read the space that you're in and see where you can find these patterns and whether you think they've been successfully implemented or not. So for example, Moore London, the City Hall Park planting done by Townsend Landscape Architects, has a ground plane that is treated with a single material throughout the entire scheme, and it provides a unified background in which buildings and elements are placed. And unity is actually a way in which all of the 7 other principles are combined in the landscape. So you can see here simplicity, line, balance, and color, etc., used in this design. The second principle, simplicity, speaks for itself, but a way in which it's often used and achieved in a landscape is where 2 or 3 colors or patterns are used and repeated throughout a landscape. Simplicity is often achieved through repetition, which is another principle. This case study that takes place in Portugal, Tagus Linear Park, the goal of this design was to maintain the essence of the space, and the essence of the space was a very simple plant palette, simple materials, and simple texture that was used, in which Toparis landscape architecture created a space that serves a variety of functions and uses, and could have a tendency to get muddied and complicated, but because of their simple material and plant palette choice, which takes place mostly native plant species, creates a very simple and welcoming landscape. The third principle, balance, can refer to whether a space is asymmetrical or symmetrical, and that's speaks for itself as far as how it's laid out. This site, the park at Lakeshore East in Chicago, done by the Office of James Burnett, this is a study of form and geometry as the plaza continues the form and language of the axial connections that extrude into the third dimension through the additional of precast concrete seat walls, the very simple color choice of trees and shrubs that are repeated over and over again in the landscape, but it's done in a very symmetrical way. And it's a modern interpretation of how, if you think back to some of the more Renaissance gardens were done in the past, they're very geometric and mirror each other on both sides. This one is a more of a abstracted geometry and symmetry in the landscape, but it still serves the purpose and function of moving people throughout the space. The fourth principle is color, and it's obvious in its application, but what's we see happening now in a current trend is using color to invite or to welcome people into a space, but also how we use seasonal interest in our plants. So, for example, bright colors like reds and yellows and oranges in either our plant choice or the surrounding architecture or the materials advance you towards a space and can actually make an object or a space seem closer and more intimate, whereas cool colors like greens and blues move away from you and can make an object seem further away. So the example that I have here, designed by Piero Duf in his master work of plant materials in Maximilian Park, his color choice within a space is highlighting the seasonal interest of a landscape, but it's also designed to meet the landscape scale of the user who's moving through it and towards it, and to have each different season have a specific color interest that you use and interact with in a space. The fifth one principle is natural transition, and this can be done from a site design scale or from an urban design scale, in which it's illustrated in terms of plant height or color, and it can also be applied to the elements such as the texture, foliage, shape, size of plant materials, etc. Peter Fudge is an Australian site designer, and many of his designs focus on plants and material selection that create a natural transition in spaces and seek to create designs that would not be compromised by the need to capture the outside views, but rather to create a garden or a landscape that preserves views from within and has the landscape stand on its own. And you can see here in this image, the natural transition is achieved through seating structures, through walkway spaces, through stairs, but it also connects into the vegetation of the smaller scale shrubs, the larger trees, and then the overhead tree canopy. All of it is done for the user scale of the person interacting with the space. The sixth principle is line, and again, it speaks for itself, but it's the most structural of all the principles that we see, and it's usually the first one that when design begins, it's when pen hits paper, it's line is the first one that goes down. It's mostly related to the ways in which the user uses the space, so reinforced by walkways or entryways, move and flow. The most iconic one for America, in my opinion, is the High Line in New York City, which takes a post-industrial line created through a railroad and has that inform the character and space and use of site. And so line begins with a function and ends with a philosophy and a theory within the landscape. It informs the way in which seating is used, and it also informs the way in which vegetation blurs lines and creates an intentional space, and then a more of a natural, gentle space, even though the orientation for the geometry of the space is very symmetrical. Proportion is one that's a little bit trickier to achieve because it depends on the existing features of a site. So whether the surrounding architecture is urban in nature, and so you're trying to balance this large proportion and bring it down to a human scale. And it can be scaled to create different types of rooms in a design, and the goal is to create a pleasing relationship among the three dimensions of length, breadth, and depth and height. And this is where I feel most designs are shown to be the most successful, is when they take proportion into account in the many different layers in which it occurs. So whether it's another example right here with Peter Fudge creating an intimate space in a larger open landscape, so there's a variety of proportions that take place, and how the user feels when they're interacting with it, whether they feel safe or whether they feel open to all the surrounding views and opportunities. Repetition is the eighth and final one, and it's the ways in which much of unity and balance and color and proportion is achieved. So it's obviously the term speaks for itself. It's repeating objects or elements. And the tricky problem that people come up against when designing with using repetition as a principle is that it can create this fine line of too much repetition makes a site feel uninteresting and boring, or too little makes a site feel sparse or empty. And unity is often achieved by using several different elements repeated over and over again. So the example here I've given is the Nasher Sculptural Center designed by PWP. And you can see the repetition of vegetation and the repetition of the fountains over and over again, the repetition of materials and color choice actually enhances the abstract forms of the sculptures that are in the landscape and complements them and makes them stand out on their own in a different type of symmetry and form within the landscape. So repetition can be also a way of creating a different type of transition or a different type of interaction and use of the space. So now that we have a foundational understanding of the types of ways in which aesthetics are achieved in the design or in urban planning or in any landscape that we interact with, the question is, how do we apply these to some of the more functional concerns and goals of our time? So aesthetics is important now more than ever due to the nature of the highly functional goals that we put on our landscape. So whether it's creating a bridge between ecology and the urban environment, to drive to design for climate control, flood prevention, some of the social justice issues of creating green space in underserved areas. And all of these functions are very, very tall order, and aesthetics tend to be one of the last things that come to the table of a designer. But it's one of the equally important concepts that need to be considered, because that's what makes the landscape last. That's what makes it want to be used by those that are using it. So what are some of the ways in which the goals of our time what are the tools in which we've used to achieve aesthetics, or how have we made aesthetics harder to achieve? And so these challenges, the three that I present here today, are the use of native plants and ornamental grasses, the dated design conundrum of plant materials and other landscape use materials, and then what are some of the 20th century alternatives to aesthetics that are being incorporated, and in your opinion, what is the longevity and future you see for them? So I'll begin with talking a bit about native plants and ornamental grasses. Some of the arts and challenges that designers use is, how do we avoid unsightly, dated, and temporary landscapes when we design with native plants and ornamental grasses, and how do we provide ecological benefits and resilient water management while still maintaining an aesthetic appeal? And when I say dated landscapes, I harken back to the 1970s and the overuse of junipers, and how these juniper plants were chosen for a variety of different landscapes because they were hardy, because they had very little maintenance associated with them, because they served a number of different ecological functions in keeping erosion at bay, breaking through some compacted soil. They're very, very tough, hardy plants, and they have year-round interest. They're evergreens, they're green year-round. We see many small-scale sites and urban sites using a lot of junipers in a variety of form. And so we have these single palette monoculture landscapes that are lacking the form that they were originally seeking to bridge. We also see certain material choices used that are trendy or stylish at the time that now may make some of us cringe when we look at them, in the hopes of creating a landscape that serves a seasonal purpose, or a multi-seasonal purpose rather. We are pigeonholing ourselves into designs that we may want to remove in 50 years rather than designs that may last and stand the test of time and serve multiple functions. We also see just bad applications of good design principles. So we see here as an example of repetition and simplicity, but it's not something that maybe is considered aesthetically pleasing, to put it politely, and inviting the user into the landscape. And so these challenges of function over form and form over function are often very difficult for designers to achieve. And the way in which we solve these problems create a dated landscape. So for much of the 80s and 90s, we looked at landscape as turf, hardscape, and then woody shrubs and trees. And so this middle ground, this natural transition, as I mentioned before, is lost, and a middle ecological service is lost because we're not designing with a variety of different plant materials or hardscape materials or user spaces that bridge this gap of plant choice and grouping. So the design interventions that are currently being proposed for our time is 1, native plants, and 2, ornamental grasses. And as I mentioned before, the work of Wolfgang Ome in the 1980s, he brought about this new texture that had otherwise not often been seen in urban and suburban landscape choice, which were these ornamental grasses and these more sculptural, structural plants, and brought about this new aesthetic that now we're taking and applying native grasses to also meet this desired aesthetic. And the native grass approach by Piero Duff that we see in Maximilian Park and the Lurie Gardens in Chicago, he is, as I said before, a master in understanding the different colors and textures of native plants and ornamental grasses, and how to create spaces that are very, very visually appealing with one material, multiple options of that material being plant choices, but one material alone creates a variety of color and texture that is very, very unified and visually appealing. Also, native plants and ornamental grasses have a variety of functional benefits. So they are trying to bridge that world of form with aesthetics and texture, and also function in that they provide phytoremediation benefits, so stormwater contamination removal, and flood control and prevention with increased infiltration rates. And many native grasses provide ecological habitats and bridges this dead ecological zone with more plant diversity. It revitalizes pollinator pockets and increases the flora and fauna habitat opportunities by creating corridors and connectivities with more of the natural spaces and natural zones. And again, as I mentioned before, it provides a new type of texture that has otherwise not been implemented into design. And so anytime something is new, it invites a sense of curiosity and interaction with the space. And one of the more fundamental ones is structure. So we look at some of the larger ornamental grasses, such as pampas grass here, and we see that designs can reach full maturity of plant growth in a much shorter period of time that was otherwise achieved through shrubs and through trees. And so when a design was put into place, it took many years in order for it to reach its full potential in its full peak when discussing plant materials, whereas now using some of these more ornamental grasses or native grasses, we can have a new shade, a new structure relatively quickly, if not absolutely quickly, when we put our designs into place. So that leads me to this term I'm calling the dated design conundrum. Is we're using all of these new plant species and all of this new texture and material that is very functional, and it meets a number of the concerns and goals of our time, and it provides this new and exciting aesthetic. But are we creating the next juniper swaths of landscape? Are we putting ourselves into a time frame where our designs are going to be removed in 50 years because they're visually no longer appealing, or they're dated and they make us cringe? Right now, we may enjoy looking at some of these landscapes, and we may really find a lot of pleasure in the beauty and the texture that they provide, but is it not a balanced approach into the materials that we are proposing? Are these strictly form-driven landscapes where they're not meeting the longevity goals? Can we strive for timelessness when it comes to plant materials? I mean, these are some of the questions that we're asking ourselves as designers on a regular basis. How do we create a landscape that serves the test of time, that bridges those trends with a longer, wider serving audience? How do we meet that triple bottom line, if you will? So what are some of these growing trends in the 21st century that are trying to address these dated design concerns? First of all, we're just trying to enhance the perception of green infrastructure to something that is multi-layered. So not only is it an educational landscape, but it's an interactive space, and it's changing the way that we look at, for example, in Adams Elementary Rain Garden, the way that we look at rain is something that we want to interact with rather than something that we run away from and hide and put in pipes and take out of our environment. But rather we want to have it be something that we interact with, where landscapes that serve to infiltrate rainwater again, or stormwater, when they're not infiltrating stormwater, they're also interactive natural playscapes. How do we make water that is considered a flooding concern into something that is a sculptural element that, again, when it rains, we want to see this landscape in its peak performance, but when it's not raining, it also serves a very strong aesthetic interactive space. So some of the methods for alternative aesthetics, if you will, is looking at a landscape from a working perspective. So its aesthetics is a part of making it a successful working landscape. So here we have a stormwater planter that has native plant species, so it's bridging that ecological concern. It's creating this artistic, interactive space, but it's also creating an element that bridges social concerns with ecological concerns. Again, ornamental stormwater. Instead of having these ornamental planters where the plant materials that we use are temporary and serve simply an aesthetic function, we choose plant materials that also serve a more practical, formal function, creating microecologies, if you will, in our landscapes that also integrate some of these design principles that I previously mentioned. And just stepping away from the single function of design and creating design alternatives that meet a multitude of goals within our landscape approaches, and creating artistic interpretations of landscape in the movement of space and time and water. Especially here, for example, the historic Fourth Ward Park in Atlanta, Georgia, looks at ways in which water was typically piped and moved out of a landscape. Now we see it carving its way through a very geometric shape. So we see a balance here again of symmetry and asymmetrical design, and also a natural textures and more typical hardscape textures to create a very cohesive design. So overall, we look at somewhere like Outwash Basin at MIT, designed by Olin. Our landscapes are trying to serve multiple functions, but they're also trying to bridge these aesthetic goals of line, unity, balance, color, repetition. USCG headquarters in Washington, D.C., designed by Hawk, is another way in which we look at this natural ecological function and this more modern approach to landscape, but also trying to bridge some of the traditional aesthetic design goals. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Lane, who has a current real-world application of some of these design principles and how these goals of the 21st century design are being achieved. And I will turn that over to Lane right now. Let's see. Can we see that?
Hi, everybody. First, I'd like to thank the Illinois Extension for hosting this webinar and for inviting me to speak about the project that I've been involved with over the past few months. I'd also like to thank everyone who signed on to listen to this presentation. I hope you all find it to be insightful and helpful. My name is Lane Kanoki. I'm a landscape design contractor with Curry & Associates Engineers out of Nashville, Illinois.
Hey, Lane.
Yep.
We're still seeing Katie's presentation.
Okay, let me see if we can get that. Thank you for telling us that. Let's see. How about now? Can you see it now?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, great. The ongoing project, which I will be explaining today, is happening in my hometown of Gillespie, Illinois. Just to give you a little background on Gillespie, it is a small rural town located about halfway between Springfield, Illinois, and St. Louis, Missouri. Gillespie was established in 1863, and like many other small towns across the region, it was established as a mining town. Historic Route 66 runs through our downtown. It also acts as sort of a hub for several of the small communities around it, is that it's home to the community school district, the police and ambulance services, and many, obviously, of our local businesses. As of 2010, the population is about 3,300, which is down from over 5,000 back in the 1930s. Here's a map just to give a little more context to Gillespie's location. And as you can see, Gillespie is a town mostly surrounded by corn and soybeans, which is basically typical for small town Midwest. And the downtown business district is shown here in the red box. It's about 5 blocks of historic Route 66, which is now Route 4. This is the city's TIF district, which I will touch on a little more later. And this is where the majority of the design work will be done. These next few images are of the downtown district as it exists now. Many of the brick facade buildings that you see date back to the late 1800s. Quite a few are empty storefronts. There are businesses that continue to do well here, including a couple of restaurants, some pharmacies, an appliance store, a toy store, and so on. However, if I were to describe the overall atmosphere of this area, I'd call it stagnant. It just doesn't really seem to be going anywhere. It's not really welcoming enough to encourage people to walk or to enjoy a meal outdoors with a group of friends or stroll down the street to get some shopping done. The outmigration of young people from the community is alarming. There are quite a few issues that have become apparent in the past few years and that need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed quickly. And that is where Grow Gillespie comes in. So Grow Gillespie, with help from the Illinois Extension, is a committee formed back in 2017 that consists of area residents and several city officials to reawaken our historically vibrant community with enhanced quality of life and expanded economic, recreational, and cultural opportunities for its residents. The committee is divided into 5 working groups, including Streetscape, which I am most heavily involved with, basically, in short, dealing with the aesthetic and functional workings of our downtown. Business development, which includes the expansion, improvement, and creation of existing and potential businesses in downtown. marketing, which will include the dispersal of information relating to the Grow Gillespie initiatives to the entire community, tourism, which will include the development and expansion of area tourist destination, including Gillespie Lake, which is located about 5 miles away, and historic Route 66. And finally, an arts and entertainment committee, which will focus on the improvement, retention, and development of community and visitor engagement activities, festivals, and experiences. So what makes a district like this possible? Well, first of all, when planning for a project like this, remember that the downtown district can't necessarily thrive on its own. Attention has to be given to places even outside of that area. For example, how do people get there if they're walking from the school or a park or a specific neighborhood? Unfortunately, I don't really have time to go into those examples, but I will explain some of the concepts we hope to achieve in downtown Gillespie. So obviously, we want to revitalize the downtown TIF district, which encompasses about the 5 blocks which you've been introduced to. We will introduce stormwater best management practices to better deal with excessive rainfall and provide much needed green space while doing so. We want to improve the ADA accessibility of parking and sidewalks throughout downtown. Introduce new and more efficient LED lighting. Increase the number of parking spaces to be used by customers and special event parking. Create a corridor that can be barricaded for those special events. Identify a few potential locations for small pocket parks within the downtown. And then, of course, the sort of accessories on top of all of that, such as the benches, the trash cans, the murals, and so on. Now the question is, how can a project like this be achieved in a small, seemingly stagnant rural community? Well, several years ago, the city took steps to develop and expand the tools it would have available to stimulate economic growth and community development. To that end, the city applied to the state of Illinois and subsequently created a tax increment finance district, or TIF district, an enterprise zone, and a revolving loan fund. So why are we starting in downtown with a streetscape design? Well, TIF funds can only be spent on projects within the TIF district. Additionally, IDOT grant funds are available for streetscape projects, as are MFT and USDA rural development funds. We can also look at the visibility of a place like this. Nearly 10,000 people per day drive down this portion of downtown. And I know that there's some people probably from Chicago who think that's just a drop in the bucket, but for a small town, that's really a lot of people. It's the first impression that many visitors have to our city. Additionally, the sales taxes collected by businesses located in the downtown area account for about 20% of the city's fiscal budget. And in particular, it's the primary source of revenue through which Gillespie funds the police department. Each step of the plan is drawn from fundamental research of our trade area and a critical appraisal of our capabilities. Each component is based upon proven community development concepts and techniques developed, analyzed, and time-tested by the National Main Street Center, the Rural Partners, Illinois Route 66, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Committee members have also traveled to a number of communities and talked to many people with similar project aspects who achieved successful results. This is a number of the communities in which we have visited. So what will Gillespie's revitalized downtown look like? This is Gillespie as it appears now. It's worth noting here that the street is 74 feet wide. It's a massive amount of pavement. That's because for many, many years, a railroad ran down the center of the street. When the railroad left town, it gifted the city ownership of the right-of-way, with the exception of the 30 feet of state highway down the center. Basically, the city owns the 45-degree parking areas on both sides of the street, which you see here. This is what we hope to achieve with the design implementation. As you can see, the addition of green space instantly creates a more welcoming and more inviting environment. This is made possible by adding very specific species of street trees, as well as utilizing what is currently unused pieces of pavement near intersections, which lay outside of the required ADA offloading zones. These landscaped curb extensions, planted with drought-tolerant, low-maintenance natives, serve many purposes. As for green infrastructure, these features allow for infiltration and cleansing of stormwater runoff into the soil instead of just running the stormwater into the storm sewer. The example here, which is from a Georgetown article, is very similar to the concept in Gillespie, but with parallel parking rather than the 45-degree parking, which we will be retaining. These extensions also reduce the crosswalks from 74 feet down to 46 feet, a substantial amount, which will help create better pedestrian safety. This is a view of Gillespie 100 years ago, following the end of World War I, at our Labor Day celebration. Here you see it today. And here's what we hope it will look like in the near future. I will note that in this image, I took a little artistic license to imagine what the building at the center of your screen could look like with help from a facade improvement grant given by the city, which is an aspect of the project that the business group of Grow Gillespie has been working on. A few months ago, we met with Route 66 executives to discuss this project, some potential sources of funding, and ways to draw people into the town and interact with Gillespie as a historic Route 66 community. After that meeting, we identified a number of locations for murals on blank business walls, and here you can see an example of such a mural. Here's an image from a little above the street, before and after. This image gives a good example of how we want to improve the ADA accessibility from the street to the sidewalk, with a ramp from the front of the offloading stall directly to the sidewalk. Here's another before image and after. Notice that in the after image, there are no overhead wires. These wires will be moved underground, improving the aesthetics and decreasing the chance of storm interruptions. Also take note of the new lighting. Existing streetlights cost the city about $70,000 a year. By switching to LED lights and potentially even utilizing targeted solar, we improve reliability and cut costs by over $10,000 a year. Granted, that includes the entire community, but the existing downtown lighting is a big consumer of that power. The building here at the center of your screen was once a bank building. It is now home to Gillespie's developing Illinois Coal Museum. Here it is before and after. With this image, you can see another example of a facade improvement grant, as well as another mural location, this time using an old postcard of downtown as the inspiration. Chestnut Street, which is seen on the right side of the building here, will hopefully be designed in a way that it can be easily barricaded off for special events, such as a farmer's market or an art fair, a community block party, and so on. I think it's also important to think about how these spaces can be activated at night, whether it is simply adding additional decorative lighting to create a more exciting place to spend time, or adding that famous Route 66 neon to the blank facade of this building. The downtown doesn't necessarily have to go to sleep with the sun. This is just a close-up of the mural that I had just mentioned. Looking at Chestnut Street again, this time from the other side of the block, we can see the condition of some of the streets, the side streets near downtown, which I'm sure that a lot of the small towns can sort of relate to. Remember that one of the concepts we hope to achieve with Grow Gillespie is to create a corridor that can be used for special events. With that in mind, this is what we hope Chestnut Street could become. The Canna Theater, which you can see in the middle of your screen, is a historic theater that is currently in the early stages of being restored to its original grandeur. The theater hosts weekly movie nights, which are well attended by the community, as well as a number of festivals that attract people from far away. By making this block of Chestnut Street one way, street parking is increased from what is currently 7 spaces to 17. The city of Gillespie also owns the lot, which you see just to the left of the theater. This lot will hopefully receive some much needed attention, and the lot could be used by theater goers and potentially even for downtown overflow parking. This is what I imagine Chestnut Street could look like during one of those special events. And with the theater in mind, this space could be used as a festival reception space, outdoor movies on Route 66, and the list can go on and on for that. Finally, at one of the gateways into downtown, this is what you'd expect to see now and in the future. Again, the addition of green space is important in developing a more inviting image. The intersection currently holds a number of objects, including some Route 66 information signage, a city yard sale board, and a bike rack. The plan is to keep all of these elements, but to give them more of a home by constructing a landscape around them. The Grow Gillespie Committee firmly believes that an architecturally attractive, naturally colorful, and well-lit downtown that has improved walkability, more parking, better drainage, and improved traffic flow is a basic foundation upon which to build a vibrant commercial district and provide a strong anchor for the community as a whole. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Lane and Katie. At this point, we can take some questions. And it looks like we have one that has just come in for Lane. Lane, what is the time frame for the change you're proposing?
So that's a long story. Gillespie is about to to undergo a massive water line replacement project. The bids for that project are going to be opened within the next few days, and that project will start hopefully at the very end of this year or the beginning of next year. That is a long construction project that will be happening not just in the downtown, but across really the entire community. So it's really dependent on when that project is in the final stages. Tentatively, we're looking at next fall as sort of a start date to implement what you have seen here. And that project itself could last potentially a full year.
All right, thank you. Another question, Katie, as you have been introducing these ideas of incorporating native plants and some structural and rain elements, are you finding resistance, or are people generally interested in these kinds of avenues?
I think there's a perception on both sides. So there's a perception from the design standpoint that these native plants are beautiful on their own, and that's the beauty that we're trying to incorporate into the landscape as their texture. And then on the other side, they're conceived as weeds, and so we're having to sell them, the design community is having to sell them from their functional standpoint and not necessarily from their aesthetic standpoint. And so it's all a matter of communicating what's valuable in the design and trying to bridge both worlds with form and function taking place.
All right. Our next question is for Lane. What's been the reaction of the townspeople? Are they uniformly supportive? Any opposition?
So I've been using the number of about 80% to 85% positive feedback. I think that, you know, with any kind of big project like this, especially not necessarily just in small towns, but really everywhere, that there will be a percentage that have negative feedback. A lot of the negative feedback that we've heard so far has been about issues that were in the early phases of design work for this project. And a lot of those issues have actually been addressed with the updated designs. There are still some people who are sort of against having that change, but overall, the majority of people in Gillespie and the surrounding area are strongly for a project like this to revitalize their downtown.
Great. Next question is, when should you think about when you think about those ideas for streetscape redesign, are you considering rebuilding infrastructure?
Okay, this sort of ties back into the water line project that I had just mentioned. The water lines run underneath some of the sidewalks, and so the sidewalks in downtown will be replaced. The street itself, we will not be changing that. We won't be repaving that. It's just simply not in the budget. That's a very expensive sort of aspect to tackle. And then as far as even the infrastructure of the buildings, I had mentioned the facade grant improvements that we're working on getting from the city for a couple of these businesses to improve their facades. Does that answer the question?
I think so, but the person who posted it, if it doesn't, feel free to add a follow-up. Our next question is an interesting one, and one that we in the office talk about a lot. It's about maintenance, and the person says, I appreciate the plants, but in the 70s and 80s, caretakers, staff, pay, education has not made it to today's landscapes. Do we see that gap decreasing? And if so, what are some tips to keep the appearance up? What do you anticipate as best management practices for keeping these kinds of landscapes maintained?
That is a great point, and I think a lot of times maintenance reflects design styles. So as I was saying before, with the type of design that has a lot of turf, our maintenance design and technology of evolution has evolved to incorporate that, and so we see lawnmowers becoming these high-tech, wonderful spaceships. But we also see that turf is becoming less and less desirable from a water resource standpoint. The need for that type of maintenance is changing, and the need for maybe more educated garden and plant identification is growing. And I'd say, yes, it is changing. I'd say we're on the brink of change right now. I haven't noticed that there has been much training. I think a lot of the landscape architects have had to educate those that maintain the landscapes during the design process itself. But I think it's becoming more and more common. And I think that comes from the fact that we're acknowledging a different type of texture of plant is beautiful. So grasses that would once have been weeds to be pulled are now textures that are weeded around to be enhanced and influenced. So I think, again, it's that changing perception of aesthetics that I see influencing maintenance more than the other way around.
All right. To add to that, our local community college is working with the Water Environment Federation on a green infrastructure certification for landscape professionals and townspeople. So I hope that things like that will help us maintain these kinds of landscapes.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think that as the design evolves, maintenance evolves behind it, and the need for these mass mowers and these mowing arcs in design that I've had a lot of recommendations for, I think that's changing, because I think that we're just not finding the use for lawn in every landscape is relative. Lawn in landscape is important, but maybe not in every single one. And maybe we see different design opportunities arise that potential maintenance on permeable pavers and permeable pavement that needs more maintenance than other pavement. That's changing, and that's an educational curve that follows design, and it takes a while, absolutely.
All right, our next question is, what are some compelling factors that are contributing to change and action in communities?
I'll let you take that one.
Well, that's a great question. I think that if we look at Gillespie as an example, a lot of the older generation who still lives in that town, and many of them who have lived in that town forever, have seen a drastic change from what they grew up with. I was just speaking with someone yesterday about this. When she was young, every single building in that town had its own profitable business. Each place, had a necessity that everyone in the community need. And those people didn't need to leave the community to get a pair of shoes or to get, clothing and things like that. So I think when especially the older generation looks at Gillespie as it exists now, which is nowhere near what it had been back in the 1950s, the 1960s, they want to see it sort of go back to what it had been. Now, I don't think that it's reasonable to say that Gillespie is going to have a hat shop again, because that's just not something that is sustainable, really in a small town like that. But I think that, in many ways, a large majority of those places is looking for some sign of life to come back to their small town. And really that's what the project as a whole is that's sort of the goal of it.
Great. Next question is, are there any efficiencies to be gained by doing streetscaping at the same time as a water line replacement project?
So to answer that question, the money, a big portion of the money that we have available to do the implementation of this project has to be spent within a certain amount of time. I think that, and I'm not 100% sure on this, I think Dan Fisher might be online here. You can send him some questions, but the money from the TIF district has to be spent within a certain amount of time, and we're approaching the end of that period. It just so happens that the water line project and the end of that cycle are coinciding. And so with the water line project, the sidewalks that will be replaced because of the lines that run underneath being replaced, the water project will actually pay for the new sidewalks. So since that is happening, we sort of decided to approach the project as an entire streetscape design, since one major aspect of it being the sidewalks will be happening in the next coming months.
All right. And Dan, I think we unmuted you if you have any additional comments. But the next question is, does the goal of minimizing or eliminating vehicular traffic in city centers, as we've recently heard of in places in Spain, ever become part of your design? Oh, this is for Katie. The question is specific to Katie. Do you talk about designs that eliminate vehicles, make more pedestrian-friendly spaces?
Yes and no. I think that there's a balance between that it's unrealistic if there isn't another existing infrastructure to fall back on. So if there's not bike corridors and walking trails that are safe and easily accessible, then removing vehicular access is going to create a more harm than good. But I think it also depends on the scale of the city too. Like certain suburban cities that rely heavily on commuter support for their infrastructure, having roads removed or any type of impact on the efficiency of vehicular communication or connection is very negative to the growth of that community or to the sustainable development of that community. So I think there's a fine balance. I think with cities that are heavily walkable and rideable, removing roads wouldn't have as much of an impact because of the existing infrastructure. But if there isn't public transit or other ways in which community movement can fall back on, then I don't know if it's in the near future for other communities that are still working on developing their green infrastructure.
All right. And I think we got one last question, and I believe the poll just went up. So if you take a second to answer that. Our last question is for Katie again. what do you recommend for a timeless design, mixing grasses and evergreens, or are there just some basic take-home messages?
Yes, I would say that the 70-30 rule applies very nicely to evergreens or natives and non-natives. I personally have a very deep attachment to evergreens just because so many Midwestern and Western landscapes and Eastern landscapes are lacking that green texture and also that structural habitat and vibrancy that evergreens offer. But I think it's like a pendulum. It can swing too far one way or the other. And I feel like anytime there's a 70-30 combination, it leans a lot more towards the middle of success rather than any 50-50 design could.
All right. Thank you all for participating in today's webinar. A video recording of the webinar will be available probably early next week. And I hope you'll consider joining us for next month's webinar. On November 1st, we will be talking about managing public and private water supplies.